Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to tackle a really strange question, a real puzzle, you could say.
Now this sounds kind of weird, right? I mean, common sense tells us that more jobs should mean less unemployment. But what if I told you that sometimes creating new jobs in a city can actually make unemployment go up? It's a paradox. So let's dive in and try to solve this thing. The key to unlocking this whole thing is something called the Harris-Todaro model. This was developed back in 1970 by John Harris and Michael Todaro, and wasn't just some abstract theory. It was born from what they were actually seeing on the ground in Africa, where rural-to-urban migration and high urban unemployment were huge, pressing issues.
So what does this model actually do? Well, at its core, it tries to explain the thinking, the decision-making process of a rural worker. Why would someone pack up and move to the city even when they know perfectly well that unemployment there is already high and finding a job is going to be tough? That's the question it answers.
Okay, so let's get into the weeds here. The decision to move from the countryside to the city, it isn't really about the actual salary you can get. It's about something else. It's about expectation. And that right there is the single biggest insight from this entire model.
Just take a look at this. The choice basically boils down to these two options. On one hand, you've got the rural wage. Yeah, it's lower, but it's a sure thing. It's guaranteed. You know you can get that work. Then, on the other hand, you have the urban minimum wage, which is much, much higher. The catch? There's absolutely no guarantee you'll get that job. It's a gamble.
So how on earth does someone weigh these two things? You've got a low but certain income on one side versus a high but totally uncertain income on the other. This, for me, is the most fascinating part of the model.
And this is where the model gets really clever. See, the migrant isn't looking at the actual wage posted for the city job. No, they're looking at what's called the expected urban wage. Think of it like a lottery ticket, okay? The high urban wage is the jackpot, the prize money, and the probability of getting a job, that's your chance of winning. The expected wage is just those two things multiplied together.
So people will keep moving from the countryside to the city over and over until that expected urban wage, that lottery calculation, comes down and is exactly equal to the certain guaranteed rural wage. The moment those two numbers match, migration stops. We've reached what economists call equilibrium, a state of balance.
This graph right here shows exactly what that equilibrium looks like. Now take a second and really look at this. Point F, that's the ideal world, right? That's full employment, where everyone who wants a job has one. But because of that high urban minimum wage, the economy often gets stuck at point W instead. And at that point, the number of people looking for urban jobs is way higher than the number of jobs available. That gap between the two, well, that's your urban unemployment. And there it is. That's the answer to our puzzle from the beginning. When a city creates a few new, high-paying jobs, the probability of finding one goes up just a little bit. But that tiny increase is enough to raise the expected wage. And that higher expected wage acts like a giant magnet, pulling in way more people from the countryside than there are new jobs. The result? You guessed it. The total number of unemployed people actually goes up.
Okay, so now that we've kind of wrapped our heads around the problem, the next logical question is, what do we do about it? But here's the tricky part. A lot of the common sense solutions can actually backfire, and this model shows us exactly why.
So, what are the options on the table for policymakers? Should they just try to create even more urban jobs? Or maybe offer a wage subsidy to companies to encourage them to hire more people? Let's see what the model has to say about these strategies.
Well, according to the model, pretty much every straightforward solution has unintended consequences. You create a new urban job, and that pulls people out of the countryside, which can actually hurt your agricultural output. You try a simple wage subsidy, that doesn't guarantee the best outcome for the economy as a whole either. And, of course, you've got to figure out how to pay for that subsidy in the first place, which is its own massive challenge.
This graph really lays out the dilemma perfectly. Let's say the economy is at point B right now. With some smart policies, you might be able to get to point C, which is a definite improvement, but, and this is a huge but, if a government tries to totally wipe out urban unemployment and push all the way to point D, it would trigger such a massive wave of migration that the country's agricultural output would just plummet, and that would be disastrous for the whole economy.
So the Harris-Todaro model gave us this incredible new way of looking at things. But like any model, it's not perfect. It has its limits, and it has faced its fair share of criticism. So let's take a quick look at some of those. Probably the biggest criticism is that the model completely ignores the huge informal sector in cities. We're talking about street vendors, day laborers, all those kinds of jobs where most migrants actually get their start. The model kind of assumes a migrant is either in a formal, high-wage job or they're unemployed, with nothing in between. Plus, it doesn't really account for the actual costs of moving, travel, finding a place to live, and so on.
But even with those weaknesses, the model is still incredibly important. Why? Because it does a much better job than a lot of other models at explaining a real-world problem that developing nations actually face. It shines a spotlight on the fact that people's decisions aren't just about raw numbers and salaries. They're driven by hope and expectation.
So that leaves us with a final question to chew on. How can this model, which is over 50 years old and was designed with Africa in mind, still help us understand the massive challenges of urbanization and the rise of megacities that we see all over the world today? It's something to think about. Until next time, keep questioning.